Good afternoon again. So we've been looking at the prophetic span study. With this, I guess the first point was a review and also seeking to identify the fulfillments of the things that were predicted. And we'll just continue with a brief review of what we had put on the record. Right, so we have prophetic spans that take us to 2019. And of course, we had 490, which took us to what year? 1529. And what events took place in 1529? The Diet of Spires and the Siege of Vienna. Right, and the Siege of Vienna, we said, was a restraint of Islam, as the Ottomans failed in their efforts to conquer Western Europe. They were restrained in their efforts to conquer the Western world. So come to 2019, we should see a restraint of Islam. And we said we saw this in the developments around ISIS. In March, they lost their last territory, and later in October, their leader was killed. But ISIS itself has not been destroyed, but it has been restrained, right? We see that. So the Siege of Vienna as a type has been fulfilled in 2019. When you look at the Diet of Spires, this is where the protest of the princes, the famous protest of the princes, took place. And we see church and state coming together. Church and state coming together as the Catholic Church, after having suffered some setbacks in the Diet of Worms and the first Diet of Spires. Now they made headway, and they managed to get the emperor on their side. And the emperor called this Diet in 1529. He called it for the purpose of stamping out heresy and forcing the princes, if he needed to comply with this order. Then, of course, we have some Protestant princes who protested for their religious liberty. And we identified that their protest had two aspects. What were those two aspects? Essentially two parts. What were those? Wilson, you're there. What were the two parts of the message of the... My brother, why are you laughing? You'll be next. What were the two parts? You can say. The what? No, as in, we're not looking at application. We're looking at the actual, just the history. In their protest, Ellen White identified that their message was essentially twofold. Snyder? Against the coming together of church and state? And freedom of conscience, right? So they protested against the union of church and state, and they're protesting for their freedom of conscience. And this protest, we're told in great controversy, won religious freedom for succeeding generations, right? So when we came to application, what were we saying? We had discussion about, is it external or internal? What are the principles of whether or not we view it as external or internal, right? And we had said that, for one, we can see an internal application where you're seeing the movement uh, what was the application? It was that the Catholic Church represents the Protestants. The emperor in that case would be Donald Trump. And the protesting princes, right, they were part of the Reformation. And the Reformation or the Reform movement of our time began in 1989. It's a reference to this movement. So the princes are a symbol of this movement, and they are, and they're the ones who are identified as protesting, right? So this movement in 2019 begins the work of protesting, right? It's protesting the union of church and state. And identifying and speaking out for the furtherance of religious liberty. We understand these are themes that have been brought into prominence by the Midnight Cry message, and we began proclaiming this message, right, in earnest in 2019. That was the application, right? I think we saw that. We had some discussion around the idea of what does it mean to protest. Is it publicly going to the, to the world and saying, or is it just the very fact of that we're beginning to teach this message, even though it has not gone out publicly yet? I think that that second idea, I find it compelling anyway. That, we're not to look at the definition of protesting in a rigid manner. That just by the very fact of giving the message, the protest has begun. And it's going to escalate and swell, fair enough. But even though we have not come to the attention of the public, we are protesting those, we're speaking those very themes, we're teaching those very themes, identifying the union of church and state, as well as identifying encroachments upon religious liberty that have been taking place in the United States, specifically in this time period of Trump. So we spoke of the internal. What did we say about the external? Because it was suggested that we can see an external application. Now this one, we're going to come back to it. Why? Because there's another prophetic span which is very similar, right? 126 years takes you to 1893, right? So 126 years takes you to 1893. And what happened in 1893? Wilson, you're saying the Chicago World Fair? And does someone want to speak to that? What happened with the Chicago World Fair? What happened in 1893? What happened in 1893? Let me pick it up. This isn't in the green dress. Yeah. No thoughts? Okay. Anyone want to venture? My brother.
I think the question was whether the fair should be open or closed on a Sunday.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was part of it. Continue.
So, A.T. Jones was an Adventist went to speak in the Senate against the closing of the fair on Sunday.
A.T. Jones went to speak.
Yeah.
Right. In Congress. Okay. Do you have any more to add?
I only know that he made that statement against the closing of that fair on Sunday on the basis of church and state.
Okay, so you have the Chicago World Fair. And it was happening on a Sunday, so there was an attempt to close it, right? And there was a protest raised against this by Adventists on the issue of religious liberty, right? Protesting this development that they wanted to close down the Chicago World Fair. What else happened in 1893? I'm not going into this in detail now because I'm saying we're going to come back to it. What I'd like us to do, ideally, is if we have opportunity, if you have materials, please take a look at this again so that in our next class we can discuss it. It would be nice to discuss it with having it somewhat fresh in our minds, with a bit of background. So I don't want us to look at it today, but I want to say, if we can, please go back and look at it. So there was the Chicago World Fair. There was also the IRLA was formed. What does that stand for? Yeah, my sister says the International Religious Liberty Association was formed the same year, right? And who formed the International Religious Liberty Association? Adventists. So, on the face of it, 1893 looks very similar to 1529 because you have union of church and state in the Chicago World Fair. You have a protest being raised by God's people, right? You have the International Religious Liberty Association being formed, and is formed by Adventists, right? Do you see the similarities? Right. So in my initial thoughts about it, my initial thought was maybe because it would be redundant if they were just saying the same thing. We can expect that each line is giving us new information, right? Each line is giving us new information. And if we just said that they're the same thing, that would be redundant. So my thought was maybe one of them is external, the other is internal, right? But in the discussion that we had yesterday, it was identified that even with this one here, we could view it both as external and internal. But then the question is, if we're going to look at this one here, what are we saying about this one? Because it's very similar to what we see in 1529. So I'm putting that on the record so as to say, we're not going to do it today. Let's go back, let's look at it. Then we'll come back to it tomorrow, God willing, and then see what perspectives we can flesh out about that one. Right. So yesterday we had covered 1529. What else did we cover yesterday? One what? 151. 151 is connected with the 2520, isn't it? So we had the 151 and what am I doing? Sorry. 151. And what year does that take you to? 18? 1868. And what do we have there? The impeachment. Of Andrew Johnson, which we saw was clearly fulfilled in 2019 and is under process of fulfillment in the impeachment of Donald Trump. And we made various points about what the fulfillment of a prophecy looks like, the progressive nature of prophetic fulfillments, as demonstrated by this line, and as well as the other lines that we've discussed, right? So I think that's as far as we got, yes? What else can we glean as we look at these prophetic spans? So please, you have your homework for tomorrow. Let's come prepared to discuss that concept, the 126. I want us to look at 220. 220. Where does that take you to? My sister says 1799. And what took place in 1799? My sister? 1799. End of the French Revolution. And what happened at the end of the French Revolution? Napoleon becomes a dictator. I like this one, more energetic today. Is it the time of the day? I think maybe I'll stick to this time if you're going to be. All right, so Napoleon is a dictator, 1799. Right? So what should that tell us? 20 years later, we're seeing who does Napoleon typify and what is his identification of becoming a dictator. Does someone want to speak to that? Any thoughts? Benjamin? You look deep in thought. What are your thoughts? Napoleon this is France, revolutionary France. And the French Revolution comes to an end in 1799, and Napoleon is installed as a dictator. Maybe before I ask for perspectives, I think I just have a Wikipedia entry. I'll just read it, then we'll discuss that. So this is a Wikipedia entry on the coup of 18 Brumaire. The coup of 18 Brumaire. Should I write that? Okay. So that's the coup of 18 Brumaire. Brumaire was a month in the French revolutionary calendar. And it says, the coup of 18 Brumaire brought General Napoleon Bonaparte to power as first consul of France, and in the view of most historians, ended the French Revolution. This bloodless coup d'etat overthrew the Directory, replacing it with the French consulate. This occurred on 9 November 1799, which was 18 Brumaire, year 7 under the French Republican calendar. Right. So, of course, this is one of the prophetic spans specifically tied to the date November 9. But yes, the French Revolution is ended. Napoleon overthrows the revolutionary government, which was the Directory, and replaces it with the French consulate, with him as first consul. That's what took place. So, antitype in 2019. What do we see? Benjamin, we can come back to you.
So what this implies the history of 1799 and 2019
Yes?
is the idea that we have a revolution, French Revolution ending, which takes 10 years, and in the antitype,
Okay, so you're laying out the French Revolution. It's from what year to what year?
9,
What?
1789
to 1799. And this is the French Revolution.
So by time it is the midway of that revolution,
You're saying midway of the revolution?
that this brings us to our history of 9/11 and 2019.
Okay. Was the midway of the revolution?
1994.
1794. And what were the two phases of the revolution? Do you remember that?
Second is the reign of terror.
Yeah, the Reign of Terror.
I've forgotten the first one.
The White Terror, that's what it was called. The White Terror. So 1799 is bringing you to the installation of Napoleon as a dictator, but that is not happening in a vacuum. It's part of the progressive history of this revolution, right? So as you identify Napoleon as a dictator in 1799, you must also identify the French Revolution, right? Because his installation marks the end of the revolution. Okay, so you've come that far?
So that is literal, the natural story.
This is the natural story?
We apply it in our time.
Uh-huh.
The fact that 2014 is the midpoint.
Okay, so now you're making application of the French Revolution to our time.
That would be the mid is 2014,
2014 is midway,
2019 at the end,
2019 is the end,
and 2001.
9/11 is the beginning.
Yeah, so that is a spiritual because 2014 is not really midway. It's
Okay, so this is a spiritual, a symbolic application because 2014 is not the midpoint of a literal period of time. It's a symbolic, it's midway of a symbolic, it's midway within a structure, maybe put it that way, right?
so therefore 220 from 1799 to 2019 should bring us to the same thing. There is a revolution taking place in the US on 9/11.
Okay, so France is typifying the United States, right? So this is a revolution in the United States.
That revolution must therefore end with the rise of a dictator in the US.
All right, so 2019 we should see a dictator. And who is that? It's Trump. Correct? So far? Yes, because we know that this was the study that was laid out on the revolutions. Okay. Right. Is any more you on that?
And so how we see Trump as a dictator, there are so many things you can see happening in 2019. One of them is the impeachment. And during that impeachment, you can see that the Republicans in the House, all of them are against.
Okay. So you want to come to Trump and begin to identify him, you know, how he's acted as a dictator in 2019. But we've made it a point that Napoleon coming to a dictator is the culmination of a broader history, right? He's identified as a dictator at a point in time, 1799. But his 1799 is not in a vacuum. It's part of a progressive history, a history of revolution, right? And what do we see in this French Revolution, right? Because I want us to contextualize Trump's being installed as a dictator, right? I want us to contextualize it within the. So Napoleon is coming as a dictator at the end of the French Revolution. What was the French Revolution? What happened in the French Revolution? What happened in the French Revolution? What is a revolution, firstly, to give you a clue? If you have a country, there's a government, then you have a revolution. What's happening?
It's a process of returning
Okay.
sitting government.
You have an established government, you have an established order. And when you have a revolution, you are overthrowing the established order and doing what? Replacing with a new one. Right? So is that what we see in the history of the French Revolution? Right. Right. So Napoleon being installed as a dictator, it's almost. I don't know if this point is relevant, but anyway, you have the monarchy that is overthrown, and the monarchy, you know, it was part of a a what do you call that structure of French society at the time? It's not feudalism, but it's where monarchs and the monarch and nobles owned and ran everything, right? And the people did not have property rights, and they were consigned to serfdom. Serfdom is like a peasant lifestyle, working on the estates of wealthy landowners, and never owning the land but living to pay rent to their wealthy landowners, and so on and so forth. I know feudalism is an expression of that type of arrangement, but I think maybe there was a more accurate term for it, specific to the French context. But there was that order of society, and of course it was overthrown. There were things leading to its overthrow, right? Wars which became unpopular, famine, mismanagement and corruption by the government. All these things sort of led the people to rise up, revolt, and they eventually overthrew the monarchy and overthrew this entire order of society, right? And Napoleon is installed as a dictator here in 1799 at the end of the revolution. So when we look at Trump acting as a dictator in 2019, we must contextualize it. We must put it within the context of a process that has been taking place, at least prophetically, from 9/11, right? What have we been seeing in the United States from 9/11, which is leading us to see what we're seeing in 2019? Well, firstly, what are we seeing? What is this revolution that is taking? Maybe that's the first question, right? What is this revolution in the United States? It's the overthrowing of an established order and the putting in place of a new one. What is the established order, and what is it being replaced with? Yes?
I think the established order is the Constitution of America. So if there's a breakdown, it has to take place. It has to take place in the Constitution of America.
Okay, so you have the established order is the Constitution. And this is the one that's being overthrown, right? And what is it being replaced with?
So the Constitution of America, I can paraphrase with the two sections that there should be no dictator and there should be no out of control judge. So in the Constitution of America, it stops a person from being a dictator. But if you have to see in the line from 2014 to 2019, it's the time where Donald Trump is fighting the Republican Party so that he can be a dictator. So himself, he has established himself in the Republican Party from 2014 to 2019 as a dictator. So for that reason, it means that the core reason why the Constitution was placed has been destroyed.
Okay, the Constitution is the old order, but what is it being replaced with?
I'm not sure about that.
What is the order that is? Rogers?
The normal order of things in the United States is a republic, but a republic is being substituted with a dictatorship.
Okay, so you have a dictatorship. All right, so I express this just, I guess, slightly differently, according to my understanding of it, which is not gospel, but so I make the point that the revolution in France was the overthrowing of an old order and its replacement with a new one. So in America, we're seeing the decline of, I guess, we look at liberal principles, right? When we say liberal principles, you're identifying strong institutions. What are the principles of liberalism? Strong institutions, individual freedoms, human rights, egalitarianism. What is egalitarianism? Egalitarianism is the idea that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities, right? Were all these principles enshrined in the Constitution, right? Liberal principles are enshrined within the Constitution. Strong institutions, division of powers, right? That you have robust institutions of government that operate according to principles and protocol, that are not subject to circumvention, by individuals, interference by individuals. They do their job, they function, they perform their function in society. The Constitution enshrines a division of powers between the various organs of government. Individual freedoms enshrined within the Constitution, right? The principle of egalitarianism, that all people are equal. All these things are enshrined within the Constitution. And we see this from 9/11, it's in decline. And it's being replaced by, I guess you said dictatorship. I have nationalism and authoritarianism, which is saying the same thing. So this is what we see over the course of the American Revolution. Then we can come to 2019 and begin to identify specific things in relation to Trump. Something I have not been able to do, but something that I think is a useful point of investigation, is that, or maybe someone knows it here, right? Because I haven't seen all the studies. Maybe it was covered here. But when you look at the French Revolution, we know ultimately it was the overthrowing of one order and its replacement with a new one. But it had two distinct phases: the White Terror and the Reign of Terror. And there are two distinct phases here: 9/11 to 2014, 2014 to 2019. We see those two phases within the structure of our line. But what are the two phases within the American Revolution? Can we describe those? Can we describe the two phases within America's Revolution? Because you can characterize the White Terror and you can characterize the Reign of Terror. Can we do that in terms of the American Revolution, what's taking place from 9/11 to 2014 and 2014 to 2019? That's something worth looking into. Does that make sense? It's something to think about. If we don't have anything today, I guess as we look at it, and I can commit to looking at it, might come back to it. Yes?
Okay.
Kuto then Bill.
There's something that Ellen White notes about what led to the French Revolution, which you can see reflected also in America, about what you had earlier noted about that balance that was there between the poor and the rich.
Mm-hmm.
So you find that before the overturning revolution, that is France, you'll find that the people who are favored were the nobles. If a noble takes a case to the court, it was ruled in favor of the nobles. And the PISA did not have any voice, that you can find in GC 88, GC 88, 279, paragraph 3. So when we come in America in application now, uh, Trump is saying that the economy of America is flourishing and it is growing. But when you go and see now who are the one the economy is favoring, it favors the rich. Now you can see the opposite of what how it is now. It is turning into a dictatorship. So we can see same characteristics of economy. In French Revolution, it was favoring the nobles. When you bring it down to the time of USA, it is favoring those who are rich.
Okay. So you're making a point that in the French Revolution, the economy, that was the economy at the time was favoring the nobles. That was the order that was overthrown.
Yes, that is what led to the revolution. Now, when you come to the time of at this time of USA, you find that the constitution it was the one when they maintain what the constitution. You find that the economy was growing in favor of all people.
The economy was more favorable to the generality.
Yes, but when Trump came into power, you find that there's that shift that
Okay.
it is growing towards those people who are noble, having investments, are the one who are being favored by cut of the taxes.
Okay. But I guess Trump is down here. So we'd have to see that beginning over here.
We can see it towards when he came to power. That is what he did,
Okay.
which is in between 9/11 and 2014.
Okay. All right. Benjamin?
I was thinking about what's happening from 9/11 to 2019 in terms of trying to bring about nationalism, as we put it, or a dictatorial government. And those two phases, how I can see them, is that in the first phase there is the Republicans who are trying to bring about the Patriotic Act, which is overturning the Constitution of America, because it is encroaching to the fourth amendment, issues to do with surveillance and obtaining information. And so by the time, there's a point in between where Obama comes in and tries to restore what the process that had begun happening in overturning the Constitution,
Mm-hmm.
with the Patriotic Act. So when Obama comes, he tries to neutralize this Patriotic Act, and by the time we get to 2014, the established order is Republicans and Democrats who are working in a bipartisan way, in a very, I think, balanced way. So that comes to Bannon and Miller, all those guys trying now to overturn this bipartisan neutralized way of working between the Democrats and the Republicans from 2014 to 20. By the time Trump comes in, and Trump is going to overturn everything and become a dictator by changing the bipartisan balanced way of working of the Democrats and Republicans, and by him coming the throne to destroy all those things.
Okay. So you're taking a stab at defining the two phases, right? That you're saying here you have the Patriot Act undermining the Constitution, but it was agreed upon by both Democrats and Republicans.
Now I'm saying when Obama comes, he tries to neutralize the effect of that Patriotic Act.
Okay.
By the time we get to 2014, you find the Republicans and Democrats are working almost very well in
Okay.
a partisan way. And this annoys Bannon. So Bannon is idea of overturning everything is to move this idea where Republicans and Democrats are working together.
So maybe in a sentence, how do you describe this and how do you describe this? Maybe think about it. Think about that. Right. We can come back to it, you know, but right. So can we trace this American Revolution, the overthrowing of liberal principles and the progressive establishment of a new order, which is nationalism and authoritarianism? Can we trace it I'd say yes, we can. I'm still collecting, I guess, the best sort of articles that make this point most concisely, but I have a few here. One is an academic paper you can find on JSTOR. JSTOR is an online, it's a website which is like a library of academic journals, right? So if you go to jstore.com, there's this document. It's called Human Rights Violations After 9/11 and the Role of Constitutional Constraints. Human rights violations after 9/11 and the role of constitutional constraints. So I'll just read portions of the abstract. The abstract is the opening summary, right? Academic journals, they have a paragraph summarizing, I guess, the key points that are elaborated upon throughout the rest of the document. And it says, after 9/11, the United States and its allies took measures to protect their citizens from future terrorist attacks. While these measures aim to increase security, they have often been criticized for violating human rights. But violating rights is difficult in a constitutional democracy with separated powers and checks and balances. This paper empirically investigates the effect of the post-9/11 terror threat on human rights. We find strong evidence of a systematic increase in rights violations and in the United States and in its ally countries after 9/11. And it goes on. So this is a document, it's essentially tracing, because where are rights enshrined? In the Constitution, right? And it's identifying that from 9/11, the passing of the Patriot Act, and in the years subsequent, you can trace a definite rise in the violation of people's human rights, or in the context of the United States, constitutional rights, right? And this is the fundamental point of this document. So you have this progressive development in this American Revolution where liberal principles are being overthrown. And by the time you come to 2019, you have what is essentially a dictator put in place. Can we identify Trump as a dictator in 2019? Right? Can we see that? Yes. Where? You said yes? Where? How? He's what? He's purging the Republican Party. Okay, do you want to elaborate? That's it? Okay. My brother?
Okay, we can see Trump starting.
Because I mean, it's correct. Yes, he is purging the party. But I think we can, tighten that connection a bit. Yeah.
Okay, you can see him criminalizing those the foreigners inside America, and even those foreigners who are entering America. We can see there is.
Okay, so but the thing is, he's criminalizing foreigners. That's not a nice thing to do, but does make him a dictator. What's a dictator? If we define the term, what is a dictator?
final say is no. When he says something, when if it is bad, that does not favor, it is something that is not good to the people and forces it, even though he's convinced this thing is not good, he has to push it.
Sounds like you're describing a bad person. This is a bad person, but are they a dictator? Right. Just looking in my dictionary over here, it says a dictator is a person who behaves in an autocratic way. Right. So, those are, it gives you a definition with words that you have to look up those words as well. Right. It says a dictator is a person who behaves in an autocratic way. So then you look, what is an autocrat? Right. It says an autocrat is an imperious person. Right. So I have to look, what is an imperious person? But it says an autocrat is an imperious person who insists on complete obedience from others. Right. An imperious person is a domineering person, someone who domineers, who demands. Right? Domineering from the word dominant. Right? They are a domineering person who insists on complete obedience from others. That's what a dictator is. So then the question is, now we come to 2019. Do we see examples of this? Do we see examples of this? Yes.
We can see an example, those who do not go together with him or what he says, he fires them from the office.
Okay.
You can see some individuals being fired.
So you see in the government, anyone who has even the slightest hint of criticism, they don't stay very long. They are quickly purged, right? And this time that has been made note of. This is an article worth reading. It's from the New York Times. This is the New York Times. And it's called Fear and Loyalty, How Donald Trump Took Over the Republican Party. Fear and Loyalty, How Donald Trump Took Over the Republican Party. And I'll just read some excerpts from it. It says, just under 4 years after he began his takeover of a party to which he had little connection, Mr. Trump enters 2020 burdened with the ignominy of being the first sitting president to seek re-election after being impeached. But he does so wearing a political coat of armor built on total loyalty from GOP activists and their representatives in Congress. If he does not enjoy the broad admiration Republicans afforded Ronald Reagan, he is more feared by his party lawmakers than any occupant of the Oval Office since at least Lyndon Johnson. His iron grip was never firmer than over the last 2 months during the House inquiry that concluded Wednesday with Mr. Trump's impeachment on charges of abuse of power and obstructing Congress. No House Republican supported either article or even authorized the investigation in September. And after hearing into the president's dealings with Ukraine, they defended him as a victim of partisan favor. So you have this fellow, he commits he commits the offenses. He commits the impeachable offenses. But we see that not one member of his party stood up for the truth or for principle in this matter, right? so as my sister was pointing out, that the party's been purged to such a point that those who would have stood up for right principles have been purged, and those who've remained to survive, they have kissed the ring, as they say. They've submitted. Right? And what did we say a dictator is? A domineering person who insists on complete obedience from others. Right? So we see that this is established within the Republican Party already. Right? We can see that, at least as far as the Republican Party is concerned, Trump is fully established as a dictator. To question him or even to criticize him is to end your political career. Right? Where else do we see Trump behaving like a dictator? We see it within the Republican Party. Do we see it more broadly within the United States government itself? You know, not just the Republican element. In ancient Rome, at this point, a dictator was a chief magistrate with absolute power appointed in an emergency. They were not subject to otherwise legal limits on their power. So in ancient Rome, right, a dictator was put in place, right, when there was some sort of national crisis, and they needed someone who could make decisions very quickly without the sort of processes and review of going to the Senate, you know, and debating an issue and developing consensus and so on. In a time of crisis, there's an ongoing crisis, you don't have time to do that. So you need someone with the ability to act and make decisions without the restraints of the Constitution, essentially. That's what a dictator is. So we know that Trump, his position as a dictator, it's not something that's being given to him. It's something that he is forcefully carving out for himself, right? So on this point is bringing out the aspect that a dictator is someone who they are acting without lawful or constitutional restraint. Do you get that point? They're acting without lawful or constitutional restraint. They're ignoring the constitutional limits placed upon them, right? So do we see that in Trump? And I think we can trace that, yes. I just have two interesting articles that I'll read portions from. I'll have to erase here. This one is from a publication called The Nation. And the article is called "Trump is Shooting the Constitution in the Middle of Pennsylvania Avenue." Trump is shooting the Constitution in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue. What is this headline a reference to? Do you know the story? What is this headline a reference to? It's referencing something Trump said when he was still running for the presidency.
Yeah.
Do you remember that story? Yeah.
He said, I can shoot someone in Pennsylvania Avenue, but I cannot lose and support.
Yeah. Where's Pennsylvania Avenue? Is it in New York? Is it New York or Washington, D.C.? Is it New York or Washington, D.C.? But anyway, it's a popular street, you know. And he's saying, I'm so popular, I have the most loyal supporters, that I could shoot someone in broad daylight in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue and they'll still support me. That type of support is proven to be true. So anyway, this article, it says, what is counted for Trump, what still counts for him, is not the oath he swore when he was inaugurated, but something he said a year before, that on January 23rd, 2016, on a swing through Iowa, when the Republican nominee tried to explain the enthusiasm of his swelling base of supporters. You know what else they say about my, so this is Trump speaking, he says, you know what else they say about my people? The polls. They say I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters. Okay, it's like incredible, right? You can picture Trump saying that. The message was blunt. Trump counted on the loyalty of his partisan supporters to see him through that year's caucuses and primaries. While he might not win everything, he would defeat abler and more experienced Republicans and secure his new party's nomination. So then the article goes on, and it goes on to make the point. It says, now as he faces a Senate impeachment trial, Trump is sticking to his chosen course. He casually rejects the basic premise of a constitution that few believe he has bothered to read and that no one seriously suggests he understands. This willful rejection of his oath of office was made agonizingly clear on Wednesday, just hours after Senate Republicans blocked efforts by Democratic impeachment managers to call witnesses to Trump's wrongdoing and to provide a full accounting of evidence against the president. Mocking his inquisitors from afar, Trump announced at the press conference in Davos, Switzerland, that his administration had successfully withheld materials that were required to weigh the question of whether he should be removed from office. We're doing very well. It's quoting Trump. We're doing very well. I got to watch enough, Trump said of the Senate trial as it had begun to unfold. I thought our team did a very good job, but honestly, we have all the material. They don't have the material. That obvious reference to the refusal of his administration to cooperate with requests for documents regarding the impeachment inquiry was an open admission by the president that he was subverting the system of checks and balances as outlined in the Constitution. Do we get that? So the Constitution has these checks and balances. You know, we laid it out. There's the Supreme Court, there's the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. And there's a balance of powers between these three organs. They're accountable to each other. None of them can act as a dictator, right? So the executive is required to cooperate. It's required to cooperate with subpoenas from the legislature, right? When the House of Representatives says we want documents, the executive is required to cooperate, right? So here Trump is violating that division of powers, right? The authority of the legislature, he has ignored it, right? And whenever it suits him, he acts in violation of, he just rides roughshod over the legislature. He ignores them when he wants, right? So what is that? It's acting without constitutional restraint, right? He's going beyond the limits of what the Constitution allows him, right? So, and this is referring to developments specifically, of course, in 2019 with his impeachment proceedings. He's been obstructing that process from when it began. So in 2019, do we see Trump acting as a dictator? We see it within the Republican Party, and we see it within the US government in terms of how he's treating the constitutional division of powers. I have one more, then we'll close. Now this one has a long title. but it's from Newsweek. It says, Fox News legal analyst says Trump violated constitutions separation of powers. Three times in the past week. So it's quoting and I think this is why it's particularly newsworthy, is that it's a Fox News analyst who's pointing this out, right? We're not encouraging the watching of Fox News, but this particular Fox News analyst, what's his name? Andrew Napolitano. He was a former judge, right? I mean, we know Fox News, but this guy, sometimes he gets a conscience and says the truth, right? So, and you often see that this guy, sometimes the way he talks, he's not going to last there very long, right? That he's going to lose his job, you know? You know, so, and this is one of these moments when he got a conscience and he told the truth, right? And he says, I'll just read portions of this. It says, Fox News senior judicial analyst Andrew Napolitano warned that President Donald Trump had continued a very dangerous trend by violating the Constitution's separation of powers 3 times in the past week alone. Napolitano outlined 3 recent directives from Trump and explained how they violated the Constitution. The first was the president's order to acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan to not purchase a missile defense system approved by Congress and instead use the funds to construct a wall on the US-Mexico border. See that? What happened? Right? Congress, the legislature, says this money is going to purchase a missile defense system. And Trump says, no, take that money and use it to build the wall. Right? He's completely undercut Congress. Right? The second time it says, second, the former judge cited Trump's order to send troops to secure the border, pointing out how it violated the separation of powers because the president's oath does not allow military forces to be deployed to deal with domestic issues. Right, so America, the army cannot be deployed to deal with domestic issues. That's constitutional within the United States. But what did he do? He sent the military to secure the southern border, right? It's in violation of the Constitution. Then it says, Napolitano also argued that Trump's decision to impose 25% tariffs on Chinese goods was akin to levying a national federal sales tax on American consumers, which the president did not have power to do under the Constitution. It is dangerous when presidents write their own laws, impose their own taxes, spend money how they want, and Congress looks the other way, Napolitano asserted. It is dangerous because it is too much of an accumulation of power in the presidency, and it imbalances that delicate balance that the separation of powers created. Right, so that's all taking place last year. So this is just secular confirmation of the fundamental point that in 2019 you see Trump acting as a dictator. We know that it's only going to get progressively worse, but in 2019, you see the Republican Party has now been completely subjugated. It's now been completely subjugated to his person, right? To his person, not to a principle, not to a set of objectives. You know, it's completely subjugated to his person, what he wants, says, and goes. And your survival is dependent upon loyalty to him. When you look at the definition of a dictator, we see all of that. We see that there's correspondence there. We also see it within the United States that he's in flagrant and open violation of the Constitution, particularly of the separation of powers between the three sections of the U.S. government. So we certainly do see Trump as a dictator in 2019. But again, we must contextualize it within a process that has been taking place progressively from 9/11, where you could gather a body of evidence that this attack on the Constitution, right? 9/11 was a flashpoint, but it's gotten progressively worse from here, bringing us to 2019, right? Again, something that would be very useful is to, I guess, flesh out this process, because the structure of the French Revolution suggests that we should be able to identify two distinct phases, right? We can see that generally, you know, the French Revolution, the entire thing brought Napoleon as a dictator, right? And this American Revolution, the entire thing is bringing Trump as a dictator. But as we see two phases here, it suggests that we should be able to identify two distinct phases in this process as it has played out in the United States. So that's something to look into. But I think there's enough information, I think we can see, to be able to see that the prediction, Napoleon established as a dictator in 1799, it meets fulfillment in 2019. We see that, yes? I think we see it clearly. The one thing is, of course, this is in November 9, and at present, I don't have any information specific to the date November 9. You remember the line that we laid out, that we have information about 2019. We understand what the sway mark is before. But also, subsequent to 2019, as we look back, we can expect more information, more light to be opened up to us as to just what took place and the significance of that waymark, right? So it shouldn't be threatening at all that we don't have all the pieces now, right? But I think we have enough in what we've laid out here to be able to see the fulfillment of what is predicted. Is that fair, or do we see it now? Yes? Right? So I think so. I think so. Of course, we can expect more. You know, we've pointed out where there are gaps already, but I think we can see enough to say that certainly we can place that in 2019. Because the flashpoint that it is seen most clearly, both in the Republican Party and in how Trump is dealing with the government generally, is in his impeachment proceedings, right? We see that dictatorial aspect most clearly. All right, so we're out of time, it looks like. So tomorrow we'll continue. There are others that we're going to look at. We're going to look at 81. 81 takes you to where? The what? 1909? What happened in 1909? Are you sure it's 1909? 1938. What happened in 1938? The night of broken glass, right? What does that typify, and do we see a fulfillment of it in 2019? right? We'll have to identify that. I'm sure that will generate a lot of discussion. And also remember, if you can, go through this one, 1893. Familiarize yourself with what happened with the Chicago World Fair and the formation of the International Religious Liberty Association. Because that'll help, that will aid in our discussion about what that looks like in our time. Remembering that these two, the Deer of Spires and this one, they look very similar. You know, you're seeing church and state coming together. You're seeing a protest. Here you're having the name Protestantism being put in place. Here you're having the International Religious Liberty Association being formed by Adventists. There are lots of similarities, but we know that it's not redundant, right? So I'm sure we can develop that a little further. But for now, I think we've covered enough ground. I hope that's been helpful. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for the ground that we've been able to cover. Lord, we acknowledge that we know nothing and have nothing but that which you give us. And regarding this study, we just ask that you may guide us, that you may correct us, that you may instruct us, that you may help us to understand the fulfillment of prophecy as it took place in 2019, this significant waymark, which is so significant for us as priests. Help us to understand it. We thank you for this time that we've had together. We thank you for the blessing of this school. Bless us throughout the course of the day and the remainder of the week's program. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.